The outlook in the Sixers world has gotten significantly brighter since the return of Joel Embiid and with the playoffs still yet to come. But it's still fair to have a wandering eye towards this summer and the potential moves that this team may do. And we're seeing more and more smoke surrounding the Paul George situation and his connection to the Sixers. I'm going to break down a couple interesting quotes that just came out, as well as look at Paul George as a whole as the Clippers continue to collapse. I will note I did watch them beat the Nuggets in a pretty impressive victory the other night. That was a give and take game, not one that I'm putting a ton of stock into. That was one that could have gone either way down the stretch, but the Clippers did do a nice job to get the win. So I'm not pushing the full panic meter on this Clippers team as much as I once was, but ultimately it will be dependent on how things shake out for the playoffs. And the biggest concern with them is, of course, the health of Kawhi Leonard, which is looking pretty concerning at this point in time. But as far as Paul George and the Sixers, I wanted to begin with this quote that came out from Zach Lowe. Shout out to Philly Sixers Galaxy for tweeting it, saying, quote, "The Sixers would leap at the chance to use their max level cap space on Paul George," sources said. George has yet to sign an extension with the Clippers and could become an unrestricted free agent in July if he foregoes that extension. So the Paul George and Clippers thing is really interesting. That going into this year, I thought that was an unattainable player for the Sixers to get. I thought it was pretty dead set in his mind that he would retire as a Clipper, spend the rest of his career out there, and I think in his mind that that's what Paul George desired as well. But things have not quite gone as seamless as people expected. And we know that there is the new arena set to be built. We know that there's a lot of pressure on this Clippers team, and they've committed some significant money already to Kawhi Leonard. But Paul George remains unsigned. And my gut feeling is that if there was this clear-cut vision of them being on the same page, meaning Paul George and the Clippers, that a deal would have been done by now. And the other overarching theme is, of course, James Harden. And it would be the ultimate chef's kiss if Daryl Morey would have traded James Harden to the Clippers, only for him to kind of tear things apart and, of course, them commit to Harden to allow Paul George to slip free and sign for the Sixers. And Harden, of course, has had his issues lately. His play has gone down significantly since that stretch when after he settled in with the Clippers, went on a real tear, and he's really been struggling. And Paul George, there was an interesting quote I thought came out when asked about Paul George, or asked about James Harden's struggles. Paul George declined to answer a question regarding how to help James Harden, saying, quote, "I'm not the coach. Next question." Now, this could have just been an irritable moment that you catch him at, that he wasn't in a good mood, whatever the case. But I do think that there's a lot of weirdness going on with Paul George and the Clippers, and I do think that all of it combined does mean something. And when I speak about Paul George and the Sixers directly, that there's a couple cases why they should be the team. Number one is, of course, Joel Embiid. That when you have an MVP caliber player, he's the type of guy that players should want to play around. And Paul George has an interesting quote. I do believe this is from a couple months ago, but this spiraled its way back onto the Twitter feed, and for good reason. I decoded it here. The clip you can check out on Twitter, but I could not pull it up here. But Paul George saying, quote, "I'm a big fan of Joel, man, and he's someone that we got a good relationship. I got a good relationship with Joel. Every All-Star, we chop it up. I definitely am a big fan of Joel." And in this setting, in this context, he kind of was sitting around on his own podcast talking about Joel specifically, talking about how they need to get him on, and really just kind of speaking about how polished he is as an offensive player. Specifically referenced the Euro step and a couple other moves that he has. And there was kind of an admiration that he was showing towards the guy, and I do think that is important. And the other reason that would lure Paul George to Philadelphia, it's money. That is the bottom line of all this. And the reason that the Sixers are better positioned than any other team, it comes down to the cap space. And to acknowledge that specifically, the NBA officially announced that the shared salary cap projections for the 24-25 seasons, the salary cap being at $141 million, the minimum team salary at $127 million, the tax level at $172, first apron $179, and second apron $190. So for the projected cap space, number one in the league will be the Detroit Pistons at $61 million, and then right there at number two, Philadelphia with $55 million. Orlando behind it at $42 million. But out of these teams available, talking about the Oklahoma City Thunder, you can make an argument for it as well. But the Sixers are the most win now outside of the Thunder. Thunder in kind of the same ballpark there. But to have that combination of pure money and desire to win is a huge deal, and something that should be appealing to Paul George and every other free agent on the market. And we know this has been the Daryl Morey plan, that it was to keep these options open, keep the flexibility. That was one of the driving forces and reasons why he held out on this James Harden trade. One of the reasons why, to some people's eyes, that he did not get quite the market value back, although I'll once again bring up that those draft picks of the Clippers, by the way, are the true prizes there. So that's something to keep in mind moving forward. But one of the reasons that he did take the players back in Nico Batum, Robert Covington, Marcus Morris, it's because they're all one-year expiring contracts. KJ Martin as well. Those are contracts that will be off the books this summer, along with everyone else on the Sixers roster. And to pull it up specifically, the multi-year plan for the Sixers team, of course, Joel Embiid under roster until the 25-26 season, and then with an option after that. Then there is Paul Reed, who signed his extension last year, who's played quite well of late. There is the little restricted free agent mark next to Tyrese Maxey's name. I think it's pretty much set in stone that he has a blank check attached to his name, and he has earned every penny of that to this point. I will note that with the Maxey side of things, the conversation and the way we look at Tyrese will shift a little bit next year when there is that dollar sign attached to his name and the expectation that he is this number 2 option on a night-to-night basis. But the way you combat that is by bringing in more help, like Paul George. And beyond that, when looking at all these other guys, it's all one-year deals. These are all guys essentially on tryouts for the remainder of the year. We're talking about Buddy Hield, Nico Batum, Robert Covington, Kyle Lowry, Kelly Oubre. These are all guys that are proving their worth this year, looking to up their value. And finally, the Tobias Harris contract comes off the books this year, which I know feels like it's been 100 years since that has been signed. Now, with Paul George specifically, I did want to note about his level of play. That I've spoken about the Clippers struggling, and we cannot keep him immune to that conversation. But one thing that was surprising to me is how good that he truly has been this second half of the season. So to dive into those numbers specifically, since the All-Star break, Paul George averaging 22.8 points per game on 65.6% true shooting, shooting 54.5% as a catch and shoot with 4.1 3-point attempts per game, 39.3% on the pull-up, 48% from the corner three, 68.9% at the rim, a 77.5% true shooting percentage in 7 clutch games in this stretch. Those are really good, efficient numbers. And with Paul George, he does have his ups and downs. That's probably the biggest critique of him, that there are the moments where he goes cold for a game. You will get the 4 for 21 shooting performances on occasion, but his peak is also really dominant. And one of the most common pushbacks that I've seen with the Paul George conversation is, we're finally getting off the Tobias Harris contract. Why do we want to commit to another guy who might not live up to that number? My first answer to that is because Paul George is in a completely different conversation than Tobias Harris. We're talking about the Tobias Harris who has never made an All-Star game in his entire career, and a guy that kind of hit the market at the right time. While Paul George is on the downslide of his career, he's still playing high-level basketball and is a guy with a far more impressive just resume as a whole. I know he's not this player at this point in his career, but don't forget this is the same dude that was going toe-to-toe with LeBron James back in his Indiana Pacers day as the number 1 option on that team. He was that cold for a point in time, and I think he's done a nice job evolving and being able to play off guys in a way that at one point in his career I don't think that he was. And when you think about how this Sixers team fully forms, there is a strong connection there. When you think about Joel Embiid at center, Tyrese Maxey is kind of the primary point guard, although I would guess they bring in another ball-dominant player to run the offense in time and allow Tyrese to play off-ball. And then the link between those two specifically would be Paul George. That's a really good trio. That's among the best in the league as far as trios go. I might even pound the table and say the number 1, although we'll see how the cards shift around the league and what each team is looking like. I know you can throw the Phoenix Suns with the Bradley Beal, Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, if that is to last, if you want to just talk about top-end talent. But as far as the way that a trio fits together, that's about as good as it gets from NBA standards. And I'm not saying that it will only be Paul George. I think that would be a mistake if that was the only move. But frankly, these Sixers are forced to do more than that. That, as I mentioned, with all these contracts coming off the books, they're going to have to fill their roster somehow. That means guys like Kelly Oubre hopefully coming back to this team. I would absolutely love that. But the combination of the win-now intentions of the Sixers team, an MVP caliber player, and the deep pockets to get the job done, I do think there's something to the smoke between Paul George and the Sixers. Obviously, there's still a lot to be played out this year in both Philadelphia and in Los Angeles. I think how the Clippers season ends will dictate a large part of this mindset from Paul George for what he wants next. But as things are currently trending, they are headed on a pretty significant downward spiral. Paul George looks as frustrated as I've really ever seen him as far as some of these comments leaking out, things like that. So my eyes are fully aware and watching this all go down. I'm all in on the Paul George experience, assuming that this all plays out in the correct fashion. We'll see how things unwind from here, but I am believing that there's a much more legitimate chance that Paul George is wearing a Sixers uniform than I really ever have to this point. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Are you in on Paul George being a member of the Sixers moving forward? Do you think that is a clean fit on this team? Let me know your thoughts. Make sure you're smashing that subscribe button, dropping a like, and I'll talk with you next time right here on Sixers Digest. Peace.